we'll get started. So I've been asked to speak about spiritual bypassing, and that's what I'm going to do. Spiritual bypassing is a fairly new term since the 1980s. It was coined by a psychologist or a psychotherapist who was also a Buddhist teacher, John Wellwood. Yeah, in the 1980s, early 1980s. So when I first started my practice, I had never heard of it. But as I continued in my practice, and I think in the 2000s is when it started really becoming popular with a lot of Buddhist teachers. But according to John Wellwood, his description of it is it's a tendency to use spiritual ideas, so ideas, concepts, or practices in order to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. So emotional issues, psychological wounds, which I think, comes from our past, and unfinished developmental tasks. So I realized when I the first 5 years of my practice, I was doing body scanning because I had really high anxiety. And I had read that this practice would really help reduce anxiety. So I started doing body scanning. And once I started going, about 5 years later, I started going on meditation retreats. I didn't know this was a Buddhist practice. And then a Buddhist nun told me, oh, that's a Buddhist practice. I said, oh. So she invited me to a retreat. I went and I got hooked. I started going on a lot of meditation retreats. But I realized by listening to the instructions that I wasn't doing this practice properly, mindfulness or vipassana practice properly. I was doing concentration practices, which is just staying with your object at the exclusion of all else, staying with your object. So I just kept on with the body scan, no matter what arose. And if I had severe pain, I would just keep moving with the body scan. I would avoid the pain. If I had difficult mental states, I would avoid the mental states and keep body scanning. Psychological or emotional, I would scan a little harder, maybe a little faster. So I was actually using my meditation practice as a spiritual bypass, right? The actual concentration helped calm and collect the mind, but it certainly didn't help me deal with gain any skill at dealing with any of the mental, emotional states that arose that were difficult. So I was sidestepping emotional issues and psychological wounds and unfinished business, developmental business. So what happened then is when people were really getting on my nerves, I was doing my best not to blow up on them during the day, but all of my unfinished business, my deep conditioned patterns and wounds that I had from childhood, and God knows, maybe karmic patterns from many lifetimes. When someone would trigger them, I would do my best to not blow up on them. And then meditate extra hard that day. I better hurry up and go home and meditate. So yeah, total spiritual bypass. But I didn't know it. Yeah. So here's Mindy Newman. It's a quote that I use. She says, sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking that being a practitioner means we'll no longer struggle with painful emotions, interpersonal conflicts, or unresolved wounds from our past. And this is just not true. Right? This is just not true. Yeah, so first, I just want to say that out of compassion for ourselves, I think it's pretty normal to spiritually bypass. I think that we're wired to spiritually bypass, that, anything that's difficult, we're naturally wired to avoid and escape pain, any kind of pain at all. There's a natural aversion towards pain, pushing it away, whether it's physical pain, emotional pain, mental pain. It's a natural instinct. And it's really unnatural to do what Vipassana is asking us to do, which is to go to the pain, and actually being with it with some level of equanimity, right? It's imagine going to you've gotten a bad gash and you've gone to the emergency room and the surgeon is saying, I'm going to stitch this up, but before I do, I want you to bring your full awareness to the painful sensations in your cut. Right? No way. They don't do that. They numb us, right? They give us numbing agent, before they stitch us up. And it's very much against society in many ways to actually go towards the pain. So using spiritual concepts, right? Concepts. How do we use spiritual concepts to avoid dealing with our pain? I knew a person years ago who had read every Buddhist book that there was to read, who sat with nearly every famous Buddhist teacher there was to sit with, traveled the world to sit with a lot of different Buddhist teachers. And but he barely ever meditated. He had a very immature practice. And every so often he would go off on somebody in the community, and yell at them or be really unskillful or have a huge emotional fit, right? So he had a vast amount of spiritual knowledge. Like he could teach you about any of the Buddhist concepts, word for word, what's taught, any of the Buddhist concepts. But he didn't have any experiential knowledge, right? He didn't have any wisdom developed through deep practice of bringing your mindfulness to each moment that comes, right? So he said he'd been meditating for 30 some years, but he would meditate for a month or two and then not meditate for a few years, and depending on whether he was going on a retreat or not. And when I worked with him, because he was having a lot of pain in his life and in his relationships, I tried to help him go to the bodily sensations as they arose. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to conceptually analyze his experience. He wanted to figure it out. Well, if I can just figure out why this is happening, and then I'll understand it, then it'll quit, right? So he was trying to use conceptual knowledge to spiritually bypass whatever trauma or experience, that he had in his body that was causing all these eruptions to begin with, all of his internal pain and his painful, exhibiting of this pain onto other people. So he had a lot of intellectual information, which was wonderful, because I think intellectual information is helpful because it helps us understand our experience, categorize our experience, but figuring something out on a conceptual level is not going to change what's happening on an internal level, right? Woman I was speaking to said, if you just go back and understand the past, then you won't bring it into the present. And I said, well, conceptually understanding that, this is a mindfulness perspective, by the way, conceptually understanding the past will not stop the past from keep repeating itself, right? The conceptual understanding doesn't do that. What it does is it helps us bring more compassion to ourselves if we understand our patterns. But from this perspective, the way to heal these deeply conditioned habits is to go to the pain, right? To be with the pain, to experience the pain on a bodily sensation level, emotional sensation level, right? It's interesting. The mind will try to convince us that if we can just figure it out, then boop, I won't have to feel anything. That's what the mind does. Yeah. But, this person I was talking about had a lot of unskillful behaviors, caused a lot of trauma in his life and whatever communities he was in. Yeah. And I tried to get him to be with his experience. And what I explained to him is we have our wisdom. In this tradition, they call it insight, right? Insight wisdom, vipassana wisdom, that develops from being mindful, being with our experience. As it's arising, we see it arising, we're with it, we see it passing away. The more we can be with our experience as it's manifesting, changing, flowing, the more insight wisdom. We have these insights that develop. So that's from bare experience, right? The wisdom we get from bare experience. And then we have the intellectual knowledge that we get, right? So if you look at these as graphs, the Buddha taught that we'd like to have them, that we need both. He taught his monastics to study and to memorize and to understand all of these teachings, but he also said that you need the experiential knowledge, the bare experience. So I tried to explain it to this person that your intellectual knowledge is up here and your experience is like here. And what you want to do is stop all the studying and reading for a while and just practice a lot more, so that they can be more balanced. So I don't think we ever want to beat ourselves up for when we catch ourselves spiritually bypassing. And I want to say that there's a distinction between spiritually bypassing and skillful means, right? When we first start our practice, first start our meditation practice, a lot of us have maybe some traumas. We have a lot of conditioned habits from society, a lot of pain, from society, from our family of origin. And that's pretty collected. And when we first start our practice, sometimes it takes a while to go through. With mindfulness, we keep bringing our awareness to whatever painful patterns are arising. And as your practice deepens, depending on how much of a trough of painful conditioned experiences you have stored up there, over the years, if you're doing this practice, bringing your kind, loving attention to whatever's arising, getting whatever support you need, psychotherapy if you need that, to deal with whatever's arising, to feel it experientially, to feel it in the body, right? To feel it in the heart. Then those patterns, they weaken over time. They weaken over time. And the more that they weaken, then the more we start to experience the spaciousness, the loving awareness, the peacefulness, I was on a retreat with Rodney Smith once, and he said, how are you doing? So this was a really interesting retreat. He taught us to go deep into any difficulties that arose. He said, if you can dive deep into and very vulnerably go to the root of whatever's, it was a month-long retreat, then I promise you by the end of this retreat, you'll be much more enlightened than you are today. He told all of us this, and I was like, okay, well, I'm going for it. I'm going to dive headlong into any challenges that arise. And then during one of the interviews, he said, how is your practice? And I said, well, I've been diving deep into challenges when they arise, and the rest of the time I'm doing good concentration and mindfulness practices. And he said, well, what is your experience like? And most of the time, and I said, well, every so often I find myself in this really peaceful, loving, quiet, still place. And then I say, oh, go back to your breath, go back to your breath. Go back to being mindful of every breath. And he was like, no, 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 don't do that. He said, don't you realize that peaceful, loving, spacious place, beingness where you are, or non-being, whatever you want to call it, is the fruit of your practice? That's the fruit of your practice. He says, so don't go back to, you know, the doingness of your practice. But this was, this was 20 some years of me, daily meditation practice before I got this instruction. So I'm like, why didn't anybody ever tell me that before? So when you first start your practice, there's a lot of junk. You're clearing a huge junkyard out, right? For most people, there's a lot of junk to clear out, a lot of attention to bring to these patterns, these mental hindrances. God knows how many lifetimes we've been cultivating these difficult mental patterns. And then as your time progresses, it gets easier and easier, and you experience more and more spaciousness, more and more non-doing, loving awareness. But before then, you'll notice you will spiritually bypass. You probably have already noticed that you spiritually bypass. So some of the ways we spiritually bypass, one way is through beliefs. Conceptual. Once again, we're using concepts to override our experience. If we believe, I am now enlightened, or I am now fixed. I have a lot of stories of people who've told me they're enlightened, and it's like, yeah, I don't think so. And I won't go into why. But anyhow, or another way that I used to spiritually bypass is when anger arose. I did not know how to be with anger, and I had a belief that I was not an angry person. And so whenever anger arose, I would push it down or suppress it away and go, I'm not an angry person. I'm just really frustrated right now. I'm just feeling really impatient right now. It took me a while to realize, oh, that's just anger. You're pissed. Right? And one that a lot of people use to spiritually bypass is, I'm a spiritual person. I'm a good spiritual person. I would never judge or gossip, or meanwhile they're judging or gossiping or whatever unskillful means that we do. Believing that I'm an honest person, right? Or any identity that we have. Projecting all of our pain onto other people and believe that everyone else has the problem. Not me, it's everyone else in the world that has this problem. If everyone else has the problem, then we probably want to look at ourselves. We're probably spiritually bypassing, right? We're all have the seeds of a lot of difficult emotions: arrogance, judgmental mind, worrying, obsessive nature. Yeah. Here's you may have heard this before, but I love this story. It's an old Sufi story. The poor Mullah Nasruddin he was saving his money for a long time to buy a new shirt. At last he had enough, and full of excitement, he went to the tailor shop to place his order. The tailor took the mullah's measurements, and then he told him, come back in a week. Inshallah, God willing, your shirt will be done and waiting for you. So inshallah is Arabic for God willing. Nasruddin kept to this agreement. He returned to the hour 1 week later and asked for his shirt. Something has come up, the tailor informed the poor Nasruddin. Your shirt is not finished yet. Inshallah, God willing, tomorrow your shirt will be ready. So Nasruddin dutifully returned the next day. I'm sorry, Nasruddin, the tailor apologized, but it's still not quite done yet. Try again tomorrow, and inshallah, God willing, it will be ready. So then Nasruddin said to the tailor, how long then will it take if you leave Allah out of it altogether? Allah is God. Anyhow, so a lot of people use spiritual concepts like Allah, God willing, whatever we do, to spiritually bypass, right? Yeah, I'm a good whatever, our religion. The more devout we are, then we can use our devotion to a religion to spiritually bypass as well. This is often when we use our identity as a spiritual person to bypass, this is often associated with spiritual materialism. Have you heard of that term, spiritual materialism? That's when we're amassing a lot of spiritual knowledge and spiritual experiences. Yeah. Our society is filled with spiritual materialism, right? We attempt to build up a list of credentials, accumulate teachings so that we can present ourselves as more realized or holy. Yeah. So we've done every single training you can imagine, but maybe we haven't gone within and done our own inner work. Yeah. So a lot of people are really identified with being on their spiritual path. You know I was when I first started. But as our practice deepens, we realize it's not about us. This practice is not about you. First, it starts out being about you. And a lot of people start this practice as self-improvement. They want to improve themselves. And I know that I've heard other teachers talk about the trance of self-improvement, where we're focusing on the self, right? And Buddhism puts so much, I think this is why Buddhism puts so much emphasis on practicing generosity to others, because it helps us stay plugged into sacrificing for the greater good, helps us connect to others so that we give to. It pulls us out of our obsessive self thinking, where we obsess about ourselves. So generosity is a really important part of our practice. Spiritual self-help books. When I was in spiritually bypassed mode, I was reading, the 100 different spiritual books that were on the market, and all my spiritual friends were like, have you read so-and-so? The latest, greatest spiritual book. And we were all running around to buy the latest, and we were reading it, and then we were mentally, talking, conceptualizing and comparing, contrasting different spiritual concepts. And we were so much more enlightened because we read these books, right? But then still suffering. Hello, still suffering. They were temporarily appeasing. Temporarily building up my spiritual ego. Yeah. So that's spiritually bypassing as well, thinking because we know have all these new books, or we've gone, a lot of people try to acquire more spiritual experiences and they go to this modality and they jump into this modality for a while, and then they go to the next modality, so Buddhism, and then Hinduism, and then Ayurvedism, and then whatever, jumping from one spiritual practice to another. I have one of my students is she helps guide people through what is the psychedelic practices, to where you have these really deep spiritual experiences, right? Through psychedelics. And it can be very skillful to go and unlock. And the way she explained it is you unlock a lot of doors that were previously closed to you. And then I said, yeah, but you still have to meditate and cultivate and have a practice afterwards, don't you, in order to maintain the open door? And she said, exactly. All the people that we work with, they have to meditate for. We suggest that they meditate for several months before the journeying retreat, and then after, to maintain and deepen and integrate, right? Yeah. But, we're wired to become sampling different items on the spiritual buffet. Just about everybody does it, right? Oh, I'm going to try this for a while. It's not working. Let me go to this. Oh, I'm doing this for a while. Feels great. Oh, now it's not working. I'm going to, right? This is spiritually bypassing. We're using spiritual practices, spiritual experiences to not deal with our experience. It's not going to work because we need to go to the source, to the root of what's causing our pain in the body. Yeah. Anyhow, yeah, there's just a lot of different practices out there, and there are a lot of different ways to work with our practice, right? So I'm not saying that we have to delve into every one of our difficult experiences, right? Sometimes it's skillful to not go to difficult experiences. We have to use our intuition, our wisdom, to know when will it cause more pain and re-traumatization by going to be 100% diving deep into each experience. I think when it becomes overwhelming, when we feel like we're going to freak out, yeah, then it's time to back off. Like, okay, right now I don't have the resources to deal with this, right? Then we find something maybe open to spacious awareness, something pleasant in our body. And we go through periods in our life. Sometimes we've lost loved ones. We've had a lot of changes or transitions in our life. This may not be the time to be going deeply to the root of every experience. Maybe self-care is more called for right then. A lot more compassion practices, a lot of loving kindness practices, right? If we can't be with our experience with some level of compassion and equanimity, then it's maybe not skillful to go deep, because we might be bringing a level of violence to our experience, kind of like, I'm gonna, that's what I brought to my practice. When I first started doing retreats, I was like, I'm going to beat these mental hindrances out of my. Guess how well that worked out? Not too well. Yeah. So, skillful means. How do we learn skillful means? By being unskillful. Right? We're unskillful. We do things where it's like, whoa, that was incredibly painful. And then we learn. We have an insight. Okay, that's not helpful right then. Yeah, we gain more and more inner wisdom, more and more inner wisdom. But what we don't want to do, there's also the positive thinking. There's a lot of spiritual bypass through the positive thinking world. Anytime a negative thought or something comes up, nope, be positive, be happy. Or a negative emotion comes up, oh, let me replace that with happiness. Sometimes that's skillful, right? So if it's not a deeply conditioned pattern, and we see this pattern of negativity, negative thinking, be like, oh, we want to see it clearly with mindfulness, not push it or suppress it away. Okay, I don't want to energize that pattern. I'm not going to energize that pattern, right? What's the positive in the situation? There's something positive. I'm going to focus on that. That's different from saying negative, no, I'm gonna suppress you and beat you to submission. No, that's, see the violence? Do you see that? That pushing away? What we're doing is we're promoting more aversion every time we do that. We're creating the habit of bad, wrong, get out of here, slam the door in your face. And that's painful. So we want to get in the habit of seeing it clearly. Oh, hello, worrying mind. I know you're trying to fix everything, but let me focus on what's beautiful today. Right? That's skillful means. I don't want to energize worrying mind habit pattern. I see it clearly. And it's telling me that I need to pay my bills because today's the whatever 29th. And they're due on the 1st, right? Okay. Skillful means. What skillful means? It's not avoiding, ignoring, or experience. It's seeing it clearly and then choosing a skillful response to whatever's happening. If a pattern continues to arise, no matter how much skillful means we use, then we need to go deep. We need to bring our mindfulness and say, okay, I'm going to really go deep with this. I'm going to get support I need, whether it's internal support or external support. And I say this often, this practice is an inside job. We're not going to get it from someone else, right? We might get the support and guidance from someone else, but the actual practice is personal, it's internal, right? Anything that's promising us to be fixed from the outside, for me, I run away about 100 miles an hour as fast as I can because that's only produced more and more pain for me, and it hasn't helped. So here's Oprah Winfrey. Some of the new American spirituality throws common sense out of the window and pursues a search for magic cures and miraculous people. The need to believe in all-powerful teachers, angelic visitations, UFOs, and other unexplained mysteries can obscure the ordinary magic of everyday life. Proof enough of God and the miracle of life. The beauty is here. And how do we experience beauty? How do we experience spaciousness? How do we experience our enlightened nature? Through being here, present, mindfulness, compassion, right? And as we do so, those patterns will die down, they'll weaken, and we'll experience more and more of peace and joy and patience. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing what I've experienced in the 35 years. But, yeah. Here's from The Country of Marriage. Sometimes our life reminds me of a forest in which there is a graceful clearing, and in that opening a house, an orchard and garden, comfortable shades and flowers, red and yellow in the sun, a pattern made in the light for the light to return to. The forest is mostly dark, its ways to be made anew day after day. The dark richer than the light and more blessed, provided we stay brave enough to keep going in. So thank you for your attention, for your caring, and for your practice more than anything. So for those of you who haven't been to our Sangha before, we open it up to discussion now.